A memorandum was written in May of 1994, apparently sent from the internal security forces in the Ogoni region to the Nigerian military. The memo stated, "Shell operations still impossible unless ruthless military operations are undertaken for smooth economic activities to commence." Mossop's efforts to protect the environment and human rights were evidently an obstacle to Shell's oil extraction operations in Ogoniland. In the ensuing months after this memo was written, several Ogoni villages were attacked, killing villagers and destroying homes.
I think it was a military punishment for the Ogoni people to teach them a lesson, I presume.
Ken and several others were arrested and then tried in what I think is internationally recognized to have been a kangaroo court.
Together with a number of other minority rights activists, he was executed by the military regime. Shell Corporation was there during the trial. People protested all over the world, begging Shell to stop the execution.
I think that if she had really made more effort to intervene on behalf of Ken Saro-Wiwa, he would have still been alive today.
Ogoni Day in 1993 was the most exhilarating experience for me. It was wonderful to see people who had been docile for so long. It was good to see fear no longer a part of them. And on that day, when I saw the large number of people streaming into Bori from their various villages, I really felt a sense of fulfillment. If I had died the day after that, I would have died a very happy man indeed.
People in this country depend on oil. We should understand where it comes from and the price that's paid.
I truly believe that a lot of the things that go on in the third world that American companies do or the American government does would not happen if the American people were properly informed by the media of the overall consequences of these policies. The media is the link that allows people to be informed, to make intelligent decisions about how to live their lives. And when you lack that information, it's very hard to take action.
TV has gone from being TV to crack TV, or to free-based TV. You know, it's so much more intense with news going, you know, and the things along the bottom, you know, and it's like just, you know, it's super intense right now.
They were on a voyage.
Family safety and security.
The blockbuster legal chart. And can your cat do this?
Back in the 80s, it was required that if you were going to use the public airwaves, you had to perform public service. And one of the ways that television networks and television stations satisfied this public service requirement in order to keep their licenses was by producing television news. Now TV news is another profit center, just like TV entertainment and TV sitcoms and everything else. And so we no longer have news on TV in the United States. We have infotainment.
More on the McDonald's makeover is Ronald McDonald himself.
Hey, how you doing? Hello, Amy. This new approach to better health, what do you make of all that?
Well, I think the clothes are terrific. You got to see them. I got a great new Go Active warm-up suit.
What about your buddies, Grimace and the Hamburglar? Are they getting into shape too? Grimace looked like he could lose a few pounds.
Well, you know what? Actually, for a Grimace, he's in really good shape.
And it's not about what's really happening in the world or what's really important in the world or even what's really going to affect you and me ultimately in the world. It's about what's going to get the most ratings. So we're treated to Runaway Brides and Michael Jackson and O.J. Simpson and all these things that have no impact whatsoever on our lives.
I think most important, we need a media that tells the truth. We need a media that is not in bed with corporations, that gets out there and sheds a spotlight where it matters. Because there is no glare of a media spotlight, the corporations get away with what they can. And that's very frightening because the people of these communities pay a very high price. Sometimes they pay with their lives.
It's all related to fossil fuel consumption, there's no question. And so when you asked me about, was it population and consumption that's driving a lot of environmental change and degradation, the consumption of fossil fuels is by far the largest driver of all environmental degradation that we see.
Climate change is caused primarily by the carbon dioxide that's building up as a result of fossil fuel combustion. The evidence of it from shrinking ice caps to the fact that a whole variety of ecosystems are now changing in response to dramatically higher temperatures.
Heat is a form of energy, and as the heat in the atmosphere increases, the energy in the atmosphere increases. That increased energy in the atmosphere causes more severe storms, more violent hurricanes, more violent tornadoes, bigger hailstorms, bigger thunderstorms.
Almost certainly there's going to be severe damage to human societies, sea level rise, increased frequency of droughts, probably more severe weather conditions, probably spread of a number of diseases into areas where they weren't prevalent before.
Our carbon dioxide levels are spiking again, and this represents a significant threat to the human race in that it will produce changes in climate that will upset the equilibrium. For example, you have the North Atlantic Ocean current, the Great Conveyor Belt. This giant river of water is flowing from the Pacific. It's 100 times larger than all the rivers on Earth. And it's flowing from the Pacific, warm water at the surface of the sea. It's flowing around the southern tip of Africa, up along the coast of South America, around the southern tip of the United States, we call it the Gulf Stream, and up to Greenland. And then, because it's lost so much of its fresh water by evaporation, and it's lost so much of its temperature, it becomes colder, it settles to the bottom of the ocean. And then travels south, back the same route, all the way around Africa, and 1,000 years later appears out in the Pacific, where it comes back up, and the cycle repeats itself. That, of course, is what allows Europe to be temperate, even though Europe is at the same latitude as Siberia or Alaska. The temperature of the ocean just goes up a few degrees. Isn't that a great thing? No, it's not a great thing, because what it can do is it can shut down the Great Conveyor Belt and plunge the Northern Hemisphere into an ice age. That would mean unimaginable destruction of human life and human society, human culture.
There's one scenario which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has talked about, which they brought up about 12 years ago, I think, in deliberations. At the time, everyone thought it was so dramatic that it was nonsense. And that was the ability of global warming to actually shut down the ocean conveyor belt. It was thought to be so dramatic as to be impossible. But actually, what we're seeing now in the last few years is evidence that it's already happening.
The discovery and the use of fossil fuel is really the single most important technological advance in the entire history of humankind, in terms of allowing us to dominate the planet and literally to displace other species from their sources of energy, to take over ecosystems, and to continue to divert the flows of natural energy into our own purposes and to aggrandize the human species. We're extinguishing other life forms somewhere between 100 and 10,000 times more rapidly than species were going extinct particularly prior to the Industrial Revolution. Some scientists have equated the current human impact on non-human life to other great extinctions historically that have occurred because of asteroid impacts or other cataclysmic events. Some say then we're in the 6th great extinction, and this is a human-induced extinction. It's the first time in the history of the planet where one species of organism has become the equivalent of major geological events in determining the evolution of the rest of the life forms on Earth. So there are 3 big mechanisms. We take over habitats, we knock off the competition, and then we overconsume. And all of these things are accelerating the rates at which human beings are competitively displacing other species from the planet. And someday we may well rue the consequences of this.
We become so numerous and so powerful that we're threatening the existence of all other life forms. We desperately need to evolve a sustainable way of life that's not based on fossil fuels.
The United States in the 1950s, was the world's largest producer of petroleum. The United States in the 1950s had the world's largest known reserves of petroleum. And the United States was on a rise. We had seen about 60 or 70 years of continuous exponential growth in the amount of oil being extracted in the United States. But in 1956, King Hubbert, then a petroleum geologist with Shell Oil, predicted that the United States would peak in its oil production by 1970. Well, that was only 15 years away. So we'd seen almost 3/4 of a century of continuous increase in oil production. The country was on an exponential roll. How could anyone imagine this could all come to a glittering end in just 15 years? And so this prediction was vilified.
I went to the Shell Research Lab and there met M. King Hubbert, who had just predicted that the U.S. oil production would peak in the early 1970s. Hubbert printed this prediction and gave it orally as a talk, and he claimed later that down to 15 minutes before he went on the platform, the head office of Shell Oil was still on the phone saying, "Don't do it, don't do it." Well, he did it, and for a while, of course, we didn't know it was coming true. And in 1970, when it did happen, we still didn't know. You kind of see that in the rearview mirror. But what we did learn in 1972 was that the Texas Railroad Commission announced production rationing is off in Texas. Well, that meant, the United States has no unused production capacity, and then we were dependent on exports. And I came home that evening and told my family, old Hubbert was right. We're in the soup now.
As it turns out, he was dead on. U.S. oil production peaked in 1970 or 71, and it's been downhill ever since.
Oil discoveries in the U.S. had peaked in the 1930s. As discoveries were constantly diminishing, M. King Hubbert realized that eventually production would diminish as well. It was only a matter of time. Worldwide oil discoveries have followed a pattern similar to discovery rates in the United States.
World oil discoveries peaked in 1963, and this is not a particularly controversial fact, although it's not widely discussed. Actual discoveries have been declining dramatically for the past 40 years. Currently, the world uses about 84 million barrels of oil per day, so that's the world oil production capacity. Because a number of countries are past their all-time oil production peaks, that means that their oil production is constantly diminishing.
Of the top 30 oil-producing countries in the world, which represent roughly 90% of the world's oil production, at least 15 have passed peak oil and therefore produce less oil each successive year. The United States passed peak production in the early 1970s. Today, the U.S. produces less than 2/3 of the daily volume it produced at its peak. Iran produces roughly 1/3 less than it did in its peak year of 1974. Kuwait produces roughly 30% less than its peak year of 1972. And Libya produces less than half of its peak year of 1970. Russia, Oman, Venezuela, Norway, and 7 others have also passed their production peak.
Between 2005 and 2010, we'll need about another 30 million barrels a day of new production capacity just to offset depletion. There's about 12.5 million barrels a day of new production capacity headed our way over the next 5 years. Now, clearly that's not going to be enough to make up for the 30 million barrels a day needed just to offset depletion, nor the extra maybe 8 to 10 million barrels a day needed in order to meet growing demand. So we're going to hit a patch probably around 2007, where supply is simply no longer going to be sufficient to meet demand. And that will probably coincide very closely with the world oil production peak.
We've been following the peak oil debate very closely, and our group of geologists is very much involved. And our view is that it's not a resource problem, it's an investment problem.
I have a long-running battle with economists. They think if you show up the cashier's cage with a big stack of currency, God will put some more oil in the ground.
The United States Geological Survey, called the USGS, estimates oil reserves for the United States and worldwide. It is on the data compiled by the USGS and analyzed by the Energy Information Administration that the U.S. government sets its energy policy around oil. One of the likely reasons the U.S. government has not taken steps to mitigate peak oil's impact is that the USGS believes that there is substantially more oil than others have estimated.
We work very closely with the United States Geological Survey, the USGS, and we think their methodology for assessing world resources is a reasonable one, and we rely on that for our modeling.
Channel 4 News has been told by a top Saudi oil industry insider that the American government's forecast for future oil supplies is a dangerous overestimate.
On a rare interview, the man that's just retired as head of exploration at Aramco, that's the Saudi state oil giant, he's told us that the estimates from the US government energy think tank, that's the EIA, they're simply too high. Here he is.
They're not only overestimating the Middle East, but they overestimate non-OPEC. They overestimate Russia. They overestimate the whole global resource base. And I think this is a rather dangerous situation for the U.S. government policy to be based on.
I've been teasing the U.S. Geological Survey. They also had a very high estimate for the United States. And I says, where is the rest of that stuff? He said, under South Alabama, just whisper in my ear. We'll all get fabulously rich. An email has leaked out from the director of the U.S. Geological Survey to the teams making the estimates saying, it's important that we have big estimates because that'll encourage people to go out and find more oil. There's very little time to do anything, and we haven't been doing anything, and we're not now doing anything, and our political leaders either don't know or don't care that there's a problem.
Back in the late 1980s, OPEC made a rule change which said that member countries could extract and export oil proportionally to their stated reserves. Now, this instantly provided an incentive to member countries to overstate their reserves because they wanted to extract and export as much oil as they could in order to earn foreign exchange income. So within a couple of years of this rule change, every OPEC country stated reserve increases of between 50 and 200%, even when there were no important new discoveries being made. Saudi Arabia in 1 year went from having something like 140 billion barrels of reported reserves to something like 250 billion barrels. We could go down the list. Every OPEC country did essentially the same thing. Now, a lot of people assume when they read in the New York Times or Newsweek magazine or someplace that Saudi Arabia has 256 billion barrels of proven reserves, that this is a figure that's somehow monitored by some independent international agency. Maybe there's a global oil cop with a big dipstick that goes around and checks once a year just to see, how much is in the tank. That's far from being the case for countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. True national oil reserves are a state secret. All we have to go on is their word for it. And the evidence is that, in fact, these countries actually have much less oil than they're reporting.
We are moving from cheap, abundant oil to expensive, scarce oil. And we absolutely are, with technology, without technology, where the peak is, where the peak is not. And that change is a major change in the industrial history of the world. And that change is going to be huge.
Frankly, I think the greatest danger arising from peak oil is the likelihood of resource wars.
Is there possibility of conflict? Absolutely. Is it possible that in an oil exporting region, the United States would end up aiding one force and the Chinese another because there's oil there? Absolutely, an absolute possibility in the future. The danger is not only between large powers that are consumers of oil. I think the danger is that there will be more invasions to secure oil. There will be more threats against oil exporters that if they don't behave in a certain way, they may face a military action. And I also think that there is an increasing, huge danger of civil conflict and civil war inside oil exporters themselves.
The biggest worry is that the whole world economy will go into a nosedive. And that's a very serious proposition. As the increase in petroleum supplies comes to an end and we have a stagnant production curve and demand is rising, the world's economy will have very little flexibility in it to respond to crises.
It's very difficult to overemphasize how fragile the supply-demand balance is. Any relatively small interruption in supplies, whether it be politically motivated or industrial accidents, can lead to large spikes in oil prices.
I think a prolonged global recession with high prices and a lot of insecurity is going to lead to political instability as well as economic instability. Regimes will fall, crises will erupt, and how that will play itself out, nobody can be sure, but I'm certain that it'll be a very scary, tense period.
As oil becomes more valuable and scarce, I think it's overwhelmingly likely that the oil companies will look for it absolutely anywhere that it can possibly be found. Offshore from California and Florida, in Alaska and the National Wildlife Refuge. In South America, I don't think any place is really off limits, ultimately.
It means eating up pristine areas. It means killing environments. It means moving indigenous peoples. It means destroying the air. It means destroying the water in an earth that is increasingly smaller and smaller and not able to handle this.
Let's suppose that tomorrow somebody discovered a limitless, free source of energy that could completely replace fossil fuels. Would that solve our problem? Well, frankly, I don't think so. For us, right now, it may seem like fossil fuels is the limiting factor for continued industrial growth. But if we solve that problem and continue growing our economy, growing our extraction and use of other resources, we'll just hit upon another one, and probably very soon. I would guess within a matter of years or a decade or two, we'll hit the next wall, whether it's fresh water or topsoil or minerals, phosphates, and so on. It's okay to imagine that, we can, as we get to each one, we can make up for it. The human mind is so, clever that with each one we would be able to find some substitute and just keep growing exponentially forever, to the point where I suppose we would have a human population such that there'd be 50 of us standing on every square foot of space on planet Earth. That's not going to happen. There are natural limits.
Fossil fuel has been the basis of the explosive expansion of the human enterprise, not only population numbers, but all of the material assets that we've accumulated in the course of the Industrial Revolution. And this train is gathering steam. As long as energy continues to be available in excess of the ultimate demand, then the engine just keeps rolling on, and more people are jumping on the bandwagon. So what we're seeing here is one species among millions on a finite planet having found the key, the evolutionary key, to continuous expansion as long as that energy holds out. But the problem is, we're using the energy in ways that are undermining everything else. So if we find an equivalent to fossil fuel, if some substitute comes along, if technology is indeed as successful as economists suggest that it may well be, and there's no corresponding change in the values and beliefs and assumptions behind the growth dynamic, then the planet is doomed.
I actually think by the time I finished that maybe I'm hallucinating, but that there is actually an optimistic life after peak oil if everybody quickly understands how unbelievably serious this is and starts behaving in some radically different manners.
Given the situation in which we currently find ourselves, perhaps the four most powerful steps we can take are bringing population into balance with the Earth and other life forms, reducing our energy consumption, supporting local organic foods that use little or no fossil fuels, and making our voices heard to awaken our politicians to these issues.
Population is a very real issue, and it's the interconnection of population growth and fossil fuel consumption or resource energy consumption that we must be addressing. So many people are only looking at the fossil fuel part of it. Turns out when you look carefully at it, you find that the one variable that determines whether population explodes or not is the power of women in a culture. In the Middle East, for example, Saudi Arabia, population explosion going on. It's creating a real crisis for the Saudi society. On the other hand, there are countries, more secular nations in the Middle East that are equally Muslim, but women have relatively equal power in some of those societies. Iran, for example. You're at nearly zero population growth in Iran right now, compared to Saudi Arabia.
If you made sure that there was justice and economic opportunity for people in the poorest countries, people would choose to have fewer children there. And if people were consuming less here and were sharing more of what they had with the rest of the world, you actually do begin to get the outcomes that both address concerns around population as well as environmental sustainability.
One area where I think environmentalists have gone wrong is to try to sell sustainability in terms of the kinds of sacrifices people have to make. They're going to have to give this up and give that up. Nothing sells if people feel they're going to be worse off as a result of doing this. Using off-the-shelf technologies, people could continue to have the equivalent lifestyle in terms of material well-being with 1/4 the energy use.
I think people should take an immediate energy inventory of their lives and see how much energy they're actually using and how much energy they need to use. When my wife and I did this a few years ago, we were amazed to find that we could get by perfectly well on about 1/5 the amount of electricity that the average California household uses.
People think, oh, how could one person possibly make a difference? But in fact, there have been studies that have shown that if everybody in the United States switched one of their lights to fluorescent lights, we would significantly cut down on our energy consumption. So there are choices that individuals can make that will make a difference collectively if enough individuals make those choices.
We do have to make a massive shift in our way of thinking, a paradigmatic change in the beliefs, values, and assumptions underpinning agricultural production. Something like 17%, perhaps a little more now, of the U.S. energy budget is involved in food production, processing, and distribution.
We need to nurture our local economies. With food, this is perhaps most important of all. We need to get to know our local farmers. And a great way of doing that is through what's called community-supported agriculture, where you actually make an agreement with a specific local farmer to supply you with food. And so what this does is it relocalizes the economy and it makes our food system not only more sustainable, but much more resilient. And that's tremendously important.
The single most important thing we need to do is to become politically engaged, to convince our politicians that we have to constrain our consumption through regulatory regimes and legal frameworks that impose upon all nations equally. Strictures against the inappropriate use of resources, against, for example, simple things such as subsidizing the oil and gas sector.
Unless the general public that is being disadvantaged by these policies is in there fighting for change, the special interests are going to win out every time. So I think one has to be involved politically with the society in making the needed changes.